Welcome to the Brand Together podcast. Join host Brett Ryan to dive deep and go behind the scenes of successful brand partnerships. Featuring pros from every industry and vertical, from mega brands to startups and everything in between. The Brand Together podcast is essential listening for anyone interested in learning more about brand partnerships. Are you ready? Let's dive in.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Brand Together podcast. I'm your host, Brett Ryan, and I'm joined today by Austin Watzlavick. She's a brand manager at Nestlé USA, working on the Coffee Mate business. Austin and I go back a little ways. We were classmates at Georgetown, and I always admired her for her marketing prowess, and she was a leader in a lot of our on-campus marketing clubs. And so I'm very happy to have her join me today to discuss brand partnerships at Nestlé. Welcome to the podcast, Austin. It's awesome to have you here.
Thanks for having me. You really took me back talking about my leadership roles at business school. But yeah, I'm excited to be here and really appreciative of the opportunity to speak with you.
Sure. And it's always fun to catch up with folks from business school. We had a lot of impressive classmates. You're definitely one of them. I love seeing folks who are down in the trenches, so to speak, working on some of these brand partnerships. My listener audience is familiar with this, but we really just like to unpack not only the strategy behind various brand partnerships, but also the tactics and the approach. And so your perspective as a brand manager at Nestlé more broadly, and also working on the Coffee Mate business specifically, I'm excited to dig into that and learn more from you about the why and definitely the how, about how some of these brand partnerships have come together. But before we get into that, I want to hear from you. I gave you an introduction, kind of the top level, but let me give some context before you introduce yourself. We have a couple different groups of listeners on the podcast. We've got a group of listeners who they're solopreneurs, or they're at a startup, or they work on or represent what I would describe as like an immature brand. And oftentimes these brands, for one reason or another, aren't necessarily ready for brand partnerships, but it's something they aspire to. Or for example, we have some listeners who maybe they're trying to build a social media following for a small business. A lot of these folks, creators, et cetera, they'll aspire to brand partnerships. Other listeners it's a group I would describe as your professional peers. Not all big household name brands are good at brand partnerships. Some are better than others. Some aren't good at all. There's very big, prominent brands that they're probably missing opportunities. They're not necessarily engaging with brand partnerships. And then yet again, we have other listeners who they're looking to improve their execution of brand partnerships. And so unpacking the thinking and kind of the how and the why, and getting into more the strategy behind why, that is useful context for them. And so that is way too much context. But one last thing, and this is the part of why I put all this context before your introduction. Then finally, we have a group of listeners that I would describe as like aspiring marketing professionals. Maybe they're in school, or maybe they're early on in their career. And so someone like you, who's been leading brand management at one of the most prominent companies in the US, they're curious as to how did you get here? What was your journey? What was your path? And so with that, could you take a couple minutes and just introduce yourself and take us through your career so far?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was a lot of context, but it's super helpful because it helps me shape how I will approach this and speak about it. And I want to start by saying I didn't even start in brand management in my early career. And I totally did a pivot when I went back to business school, coming from a very traditional federal government veterans healthcare consulting background. So everything that I know about brand management and how to message and position brands has really come from my time at Nestlé. But yeah, just a little bit about me and my background. I am a brand manager at Nestlé, and I work on the Coffee Mate business. We're over a $2 billion brand. So we are one of the largest brands that is owned by Nestle in the United States. And I think the biggest thing about that is we have a lot of flexibility in terms of how much money and opportunity we see for our brand. We're a long-standing legacy brand. We were established back in 1961. So it's been over 60 years that we've been in market. And I think our biggest challenge has always been, how do we continue to maintain relevance for this brand that has a strong brand awareness and equity, but was really struggling with keeping prominence with the younger consumer. My journey at Nestle really began with smaller brands. I started in global brands, our global brands division, working on more international brands such as Maggi and Bochera, Maria Crema. They're very powerful globally, but in the United States, they're smaller. And we were really challenged with how do we make them more mainstream with a modern day consumer. And so that had a lot of learning experience. I also worked on another division at Nestle called Moneyball, where we were more about profit generation for our company, so that we were working on brands that didn't necessarily do anything flashy in terms of innovation or investments in media, but really were prized jewels within our company because they've been around for so long and really helped stabilize our business and our top line sales. I think taking all of that experience and then having it in my arsenal to be able to fuel like a big legacy brand like Coffee Mate has really made me well positioned for this role that I'm in right now. And my number one objective is increasing relevance, cultural relevance specifically for the brand. And I think partnerships plays a big role in that, because we realize that we have strength in numbers and partnerships as well. It's not just what we can do as a brand standalone, but how some of our best allies in the brand in the CPG world can really help pave that path for us. That's a little bit about me and my background. I've been with Nestle for over 6 years now. And I think it just came with a lot of really great experience, lessons learned, failing forward that helped bring me to where I am today.
I love that. And thank you for sharing your journey with us. I want to ask after a few of the things you mentioned. Right there at the end, you talked about failing forward a little bit. I realize that maybe that comment is attributed more to than just simply brand partnerships. But one of the things I think about a lot is for these big, prominent legacy brands, I think relevancy, it's always the struggle, right? Especially today where information moves at the speed of the internet. They say attention is the new currency, and everyone's trying to capture the interest and attention of consumers. Not everything that captures attention today is something that a legacy brand would necessarily want associated with it. You don't have to look too far back in time to find something. I don't know. I remember when kids were eating Tide Pods or sticking their tongues on toilet bowls and that kind of, there's all these viral things that just capture attention. And so as a legacy brand, how do you go about developing partnership initiatives that keep your legacy brand protected while still generating the kind of relevancy that is strategically useful to Nestle?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's something that we challenge ourselves with, honestly, on a daily, if not hourly basis at my job, because things are so fast moving and opportunities come to us frequently in terms of how we can approach them, jump on them, and create relevance. And like you said, not all relevance is good relevance, not all attention is good attention. I would think that we are very strategic about how we show up in society. We are not necessarily a brand that wants attention just for the sake of getting it. We have a really strong, loyal group of consumers who actually are 55 plus and have been buying our brand for a very long time. So we're constantly challenging ourselves with how is our core consumer who has got us to the place that we are today going to receive this new way of showing up for the brand. And it's extremely important that we don't lose even an ounce of those sales because it's the foundation of our business. Now, when we think about future growth for Coffee Mate, that's going to come from younger households. So it's constantly a push and pull of us trying to strike the right balance of becoming culturally relevant without leaving that core consumer behind. And I would say that in terms of protecting our brand, we spend a lot of time on foundational and strategic documents and resources that not only bring our internal stakeholders along, but also our external ones. We use a mantra and a slogan, a tagline, a campaign or platform as our guiding light. So right now, our platform is really about championing all coffee lifestyles. And we do that because it doesn't alienate our core consumer. Coffee can really be a lifestyle for anyone. It can be drank during the daytime and at nighttime. It can be drank at any times of the day in any different types of ways, espresso martinis or matchas or lattes, things like that. And as we insert ourselves into culture, we constantly pressure test that this is something that we are doing to be moving towards more of a lifestyle brand. And so in terms of protecting, we have a lot of people that review and re-review material. We try to align with our objectives of the why behind we're doing something. Is this to drive conversion for the brand, or is this to drive more cultural relevance? Is this safe for brands? We have a lot of protection around it as well. And it's also about taking risks. So we have a legal team that kind of helps monitor as well in terms of, is this something that can be taken down and we can react to quickly on social media? Or is this a television commercial that we're broadcasting to a very large audience that wouldn't necessarily, we can get it super fast on it? And so I would say that right now we have a large appetite for risk. We are looking at things and really saying, how risky is this? And is this something that we feel like we can always come back from? So I would say that not only Coffee Mate, but I think about brands like Heinz Ketchup, and I think about brands like Old Spice, that they had to take risks to be able to continue maintaining relevance. And right now, Coffee Mate is on the brink of doing something very similar, where we don't necessarily want to let our legacy fall to the wayside because it's the core and the heart of who we are. But we do need to push ourselves into new territories and spaces that generate that social engagement, that buzz, that water cooler talk that is going to make sure that we have growth for a sustained long period of time. So I would say it's always about what is a brand's appetite for risk and what is the reward and the payoff that you get from that. It's always good to have an objective and a foundation as to the why you're doing something versus just doing things because they're trendy. Because trends are, to me, like splashes in a pan. They're here and they're gone. And then people were talking about you, and it may not always be the right thing that you can come back from. I think the biggest one I think about is Pepsi and their spot a long time ago, and how they really thought they were leaning in at the right messaging and direction, but it backfired in such a detrimental way that it was very hard for them to come back. And they've been putting in a lot of work to come back from that and really position themselves as more like an entertainment and lifestyle brand. But they have the power and the resources to be able to do that. They spend $50 million in media one year. They're going to double down on that the next year, and they can come back from that in a very strong way. I would say brands that are up and coming, it's a double-edged sword. I think about startups, and they are definitely more risky. Like they don't have a huge reputation that they can ruin. And so it's more for them. If people are talking about them, that's good publicity. And work is good publicity. And I feel like your appetite for risk would be way larger, especially because you don't have people coming after you to try to tear you apart. A big, giant food and beverage company like Nestlé, there are people constantly looking and waiting for us to mess up. But then I also think about, what is your risk mitigation plan? If something were to backfire, is it something that you can cover up and fix quickly? Or is that going to really take a lot of resources and time that you don't have to do that? So it's always about pre-planning and being thoughtful, but at the same time, challenging yourself to move quickly and taking on a little bit more risk so that you don't fall too far behind times and how quickly things are moving.
No,
so that was a long-winded answer.
No, that was a perfect answer and very insightful. I love the examples you gave. First of all, I think you're absolutely right. I think, to just touch on some of the things you mentioned, really, I think your answer provides some insight as to how important having strong internal direction and alignment on brand direction and strategy can be. And when you talk about startups and really immature brands, sometimes they don't have the benefit of that, or maybe they do have the benefit of that, but no one has a crystal ball, and there might be some kind of might have some emergent growth from something that falls outside of that initial brand guidance. And one of the things I appreciate about your answer is you guys understand who your core consumers are. And that's if we take a risk and do something a little risky, as long as we protect that core segment that's responsible for driving a lot of our current revenue, it's really hard to sink the ship, so to speak. And I appreciate that answer. And then the other thing is, you mentioned Pepsi. That's one of the examples that comes to my mind too. And it's interesting. I saw some data recently, and I don't know if it correlates perfectly with our discussion here but I saw some data recently that suggested that Pepsi was losing market share relative to Coca-Cola, but also to Dr. Pepper. And you read some of the analysis, some of the press about this, and it's, Dr. Pepper's been doing a better job at courting the younger consumers. They're doing a better job at, you mentioned when you were talking about Coffee Mate's plans, eventually we're going to have to court the younger demographic. And that was, the analysts are basically, that's where it's at, right? Dr. Pepper's doing a better job. They're eating Pepsi's lunch there. Whether or not that's true, I'm not sure. But it's interesting because Pepsi has totally been such a risk taker in the past. And if you look at kind of their brand story, they've been involved in, so people still talk about the Harrier jet thing that happened in like 1990. Do you remember that?
No, what is this? The Harrier jet.
So back in the 90s, they had this Pepsi points program where every time you purchased a Pepsi and under the cap, you'd get a certain amount of
points. Yes. Okay. I remember that.
You remember this? And it was like some impossible amount, like 1 million Pepsi points, and you could trade it in for a Harrier jet. And some guy actually did it. And he's like, where's my jet? They're like, is this big?
There's no jet.
Yeah. And then more recently, if you remember the Caitlyn Jenner spot, I remember being really controversial. They've just had a number of them. And I'll wave my white flag, throw my hands up. I haven't been following Pepsi's brand story super closely, but it does make me think about that balance. You could definitely say that they're a brand that's erred on the side of risk and how it's not gone well. And so that gives us a useful contrast to, I think, Nestlé and Coffee Mate's more deliberate, measured approach. So I appreciate that. Speaking of Dr. Pepper, one of the things, I don't want to just, did you have any thoughts on that at all?
Well, it's just, I think it's an interesting thought. And when I think about soda and the soda industry, they are extremely challenged to do something different. They have to stand out. The appetite for risk in the soda industry is so big. And I think we're feeling that a little in coffee as well, too, is when we see all this swapping between categories. But soda for a long time was just not something that people really wanted. There were a lot of health risks. There were so many other things that could be substituted for it. And now I feel like it's really coming back and having its moment. I think Pepsi and Coke obviously will always be these legacy soda brands, but I see little brands like Poppy. To me, Poppy is a brand that's popping up and is super inspirational. They are taking a lot of risk and they're getting some backlash, but they're continuing to move at an accelerated rate. And they're testing and learning in all these different spaces. And I think it's putting some fire under the giants to make them really start questioning, what is our messaging, what's our position in the soda industry, how are we going to keep maintaining relevance. And it's like what we're feeling with Coffee Mate as well, a little bit less of the pressure, but we see that also with smaller competitors like Chobani is coming in and they're taking a little bit more risk in terms of the coffee creamer space. Yeah, it's just really interesting to hear you talk about the risk that Pepsi takes. And I think that it goes back to my original point. They just have a huge amount of resources where they're just putting everything forward. And then if it fails, they're moving on to the next thing and not dwelling.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good example.
Yeah, no, that's great. I love some of the examples you gave, and it really makes me think about, earlier we were talking about the immature brands versus the mature brand. That's not a perfect dichotomy, but the differences in approach. But it's also about who are the other competitors in the market. And Coke, Pepsi, they're these 800-pound gorillas, and there's parallels to that in a lot of CPG categories. And how you go about it. You mentioned Chobani. I'm sure they've got a huge appetite for risk because they know if they're going to enter the coffee creamer space, Coffee Mate's there, right? And
Yeah.
that's wonderful. One of the brand partnerships that I saw recently that Coffee Mate did that honestly I admire a lot, and I'm so excited to have you here to talk about it a little bit, is you guys recently had a partnership initiative with Dr. Pepper, which we were just talking about. And can you help me understand, just unpack for our listeners, how did that come together? Let me say this real quick. I don't want to kill you with context again, but I live in Idaho, and out here in Idaho, it's something I can't remember the first time I saw someone put coffee creamer in soda. It must have been at a gas station and some trucker did it, and when everyone's giving them weird looks. And that was my first experience with that, but I'm putting the cart before the horse a little bit. I wanted to ask, I'm so curious, how did this partnership, what was the inception of it? How did you guys determine that Dr. Pepper would be a good partnership candidate for Coffee Mate? What incepted it? How did it come from an idea to reality? What was the thinking behind that?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm not a soda drinker, but I do drink coffee creamer frequently. And honestly, when the opportunity came on my desk, I had the same questions you did. Like, where did this evolve from? And I'm not sure if you've heard of a small celebrity named Olivia Rodrigo.
Yes.
Well, she's not so small anymore, but she actually had created a viral TikTok of her going to Swigs in Utah, which is a beverage fountain drink stop. And she created a concoction called a dirty soda and posted about it. It got a lot of attention, mainly because this is the best kept secret of Utah. And also, it wasn't necessarily new news, but it was something that people wanted to start talking about. It's like, it happened honestly like around pandemic times. And as detrimental as the pandemic was, it really created new experiences for people in the house to create new concoctions from beverage, food, all different types of recipes. People were into it. It wasn't just something they were doing it because they had to cook for their family or because they had to make things at home. It was they actually enjoyed trying new recipes.
Yeah.
And so that fueled the social phenomenon of a dirty soda, which is what the traditional recipe is actually like mixing one type of dark kind of cola soda, typically Dr. Pepper, with a coconut flavored creamer and like a squeeze of lime. And you can drink it over ice, like with a straw. And it originated also originally in more like Mormon cultures because, they try to really limit like alcohol drinking and they're pretty limited with what they can consume. And so in Mormon culture, it's very familiar.
Yeah.
Actually just did a partnership with one of the Mormon housewives who is a coffee mate fanatic and always use Coffee Mate. So to just more amplify that message. But anyways, getting back to your origin story of how dirty soda came alive, Olivia Rodrigo posted about it. It turned into a social phenomenon. People were craving it, looking for it. And we were already going to do a dirty soda creamer. So a recipe specifically made for soda that had a different formula. It tasted and looked very similar to what we typically use in coffee, but it was specifically made for soda to help cut some of the acidity of a soda and the sweetness and also have the same type of dissolving power in bubbles versus a hot or cold coffee.
Yeah.
So we had a lot of R&D that went behind this, and we were just going to launch a Coffee Mate dirty soda creamer. And this was all around our brand objective to expand in different usage occasions for coffee creamer and get outside of the coffee creamer aisle. In a little bit of context about what that space looked like in the retail environment, coffee creamer aisles are pretty limited in space, and there's so many new entrants coming in that for us to grow, we know that we have to go beyond the coffee cup. And so one of the ways we could do that is with soda. And so as we're developing this, our new CMO is very ambitious, and she was like, we need to make this bigger. So let's approach your Dr. Pepper for a partnership opportunity. And the evaluation behind that wasn't because we could have approached Pepsi.
Yeah.
The evaluation behind that really lied in what is another brand that has a similar creative communication and brand objective to Coffee Mate. And we know that Dr. Pepper is unlocking a lot of power within new flavors. And they also had a little bit more of an appetite in terms of partnerships and what that partnership can do for their consumer base. I would definitely say they're a little bit more cool than our brands, but in terms of soda in general, it's just a very broad audience of people who drink it at all different times of the day. But one of the things that we would benefit from with partnering with Dr. Pepper is that penetration into the soda aisle and capturing a new consumer that maybe doesn't consider coffee, but does consider soda, and bringing that equity of soda into our brand. Where they benefit from partnering with Coffee Mate is a known brand that is going to stand up the best dirty soda recipe that consumers can buy. And it's trusted. We have a lot of loyalty from our consumers. We have a lot of equity in that space. And so as we both have these missions of trying to build equity in different categories of the grocery store, we know we could have a mutual beneficial relationship. And I know we think about brand partnerships, there's a lot of nuance there and questions as to why and how. So that's really how partnership happened with Coffee Mate and Dr. Pepper. We actually approached them. We pitched it to them. They were super receptive and very excited about the opportunity. They have a very robust communications team of people who wanted to participate and contribute to the partnership as well. And so honestly, it was just a beautiful kind of collaboration that happened from there.
I love that answer. I love so many things about your answer. So let me tell you, let me go all the way back to the beginning. Yeah. Talk about Mormon cold. I live in Idaho. We call Idaho and Utah the Mormon Belt, right? There's a custom full service soda shop on every other corner. It's crazy. And it definitely comes from that. The context of our religion doesn't allow us to pursue a lot of vices, but you know what? Sugary drinks is one of them, right? We can do our sodas, also cookies and baked goods. That's huge here. And so I love that. The other thing I'll say is I love what you guys have done from the product side. There's a qualitative difference between, so for example, if you want to do a brand partnership, you can partner with a celebrity, pay them some money, and they'll get on TV and say, oh, this is a good right? That's like the lowest level of a brand part. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have really well integrated partnerships where both sides of that partnership really invest in the partnership. And in your case, I love the idea of creating a compositionally different coffee creamer specifically formulated for dirty sodas. That's instantly puts you a tier above. You go into a gas station or one of these soda shops, they've got nothing behind the counter like that. It's just, they're just taking from the coffee creamer aisle, right? So to have a product that's presented as, no, this is specially formulated for this use case, that's really powerful. And I can guarantee you it's got a better quality.
So yeah, definitely. And I think that's what consumers expect nowadays too. We cannot just have influencers and creators like endorsing our products. That does get you so far, but I think that there is a lot of feedback and scrutiny from consumers nowadays that expect brands to tailor their products, tailor their messagings to really give consumers what they're looking for and show how are they authentically and genuinely different versus just telling us to buy something and pushing a product or paying like a high profile celebrity to endorse it. So yeah, definitely.
Definitely. It's like the consumer radar for inauthenticity is so dialed in. And you see it everywhere. Like calling a creator a sellout. If they partner with a brand or a product that even has like a smidge of it's anyway. But I love that example. One of the things I'm curious about, and I'd love to hear this from your perspective, it's working on Coffee Mate, but also with Nestlé more broadly. What is the overall strategic impetus with brand partnerships?
Let me just jump into it.
Yeah.
Because I think that I answered it in terms of brands being mutually beneficial and like benefiting from one another. But when I think how we look at brand partnerships. So like I said, I work on a spectrum of different brands, small brands, large brands. I would say Coffeemate's well positioned to do brand partnerships because we're specifically looking for brands that can help elevate our cultural relevance in the marketplace with consumers to make us honestly cool. We want to be cool. We want to be a cool brand. So we're looking for other brands that can make us cool or that are cool and have that cool factor. Now, what our overarching goal with a brand partnership strategy, because we do have limited time offerings and licensing partnerships that we do with our creamers. So we partner with Twix and Hershey's company before and Mars. We've partnered with Kahlua. We did a Mean Girls partnership earlier this year and Kellogg and other locals. So we have done a lot within the food and beverage space. Our newest area that we are focusing on is entertainment properties, pushing the boundaries beyond just food and beverage. But I'd say the thing that we really look for is one who's going to help us move the needle on relevance and equity with younger households and consumers. That is our growth target. But at the end of the day, we are a business and we want to see sales, right? So you also look for what are those branded partnerships that have very fruitful and ample opportunity for sustained growth. Because a lot of times we'll partner and we will see a big uptick as things are popular and then they'll drop down in sales, which we totally expect. But what we want to see would be more sustained, longer term growth, engagement, conversation about what we're doing and how that ladders up to our creative objectives and communications objectives in the future. And so right now we're repositioning ourselves as a brand. And so we want to find things that are going to be very beneficial to that goal.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily about market share. We don't anticipate to move the needle on market share necessarily with a branded partnership, but where dirty soda actually came into be a very rich opportunity for us is that it was just going to be a limited time offering. And we actually only partnered with select retailers to be featured in a display in the soda aisle. But our retailer partners loved it so much that we're coming back as a national product, and it ended up getting us incremental distribution for Coffee Mate for longer term growth. And this is something that is now going to be a new platform for us that we're going to continue to ideate around and that we will continue to have as an additional placement in our store. I think it's all about the smaller opportunities that could become something a little bit bigger. We don't want to spend a lot of time and resources on something that is really just super short-lived and can't at the very least give us any learning. I would say that's the biggest one. And some of them are just total no-brainers, right? When we think about staying in a safe space like food and beverage, but some of the ones that are really pushing the boundaries. And I think what e.l.f. is doing, which is a makeup brand, and they have partnered across categories with Tinder, Chipotle, Dunkin' Donuts, and their makeup is less about what the makeup is, the color scheme, because you could just have a burgundy eyeshadow, but they actually are calling things like glazed donut, or they're leaning into what the true power behind the brand of Tinder is and how there's synergies between e.l.f. and Tinder. So I really love that. I love that brand. I think Oreo and Coke having this partnership. Yes, that's playing within food and beverage, but people are so curious as to what an Oreo flavored Coke could taste like. That for me is, while they're pushing the boundaries and they're also just playing in a space to test and learn, to get those learnings, to understand this is something for a longer term, more fruitful opportunity for the brand. And so this kind of gets back to the place where I feel like brands can scale forward. Unfortunately, not every brand can do that, but branded partnerships very much are a risk-taking initiative. And sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But at the very end of the day, you should always get learnings from them.
This is total, I don't have data for this, but it seems to me that consumers are pretty positively receptive to brands that experiment a lot with brand partnerships. You mentioned Oreos. I think there's been so many different, there was like Swedish Fish and Sour Patch Kids and this and every candy under the sun. And there's no way all those flavors were just knocked it out of the park, right? Some of those probably did not taste great. There's no way that every one of those flavors mapped to every one of their consumer groups in a positive way. But nowadays, it's like folks see Oreo and Coke, and there's very little, if any, negative it's not a negative brand event at all for Oreo, right? Consumers are used to that brand experimenting. And Coke, of course, they do a lot of experimentation with their flavors as well. So I love those examples you gave. Austin, thank you for joining us today. You've been brilliantly insightful. I really appreciate you spending a little bit of time with us, and I really appreciate you unpacking some of the brand partnership thinking that you and Nestle and Coffee Mate have been engaged in for our listener audience. So thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. This has been a pleasure.
And real quick, where can our listeners find you? If they want to follow you or connect with you in some way, where do we find you?
I'm always open to growing my network on LinkedIn. You can find me by my first and last name, Austin Watzlavick. And then, yeah, that's pretty much like where I continue to grow my professional network. So would love to just connect people there.
Cool. All right. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll talk to you again soon.
This has been another episode of the Brand Together podcast with your host, Brett Ryan. Join us again next week for another deep dive into brand partnerships. And remember to subscribe to the Brand Together podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, or anywhere else podcasts are found.